So I'll start off with a video that scopes out the issues around food security in northern Manitoba and locates it. So Matt, if you could press play. This large survey is a wake-up call to Canadians that it's not only third world countries that have food insecurity and people going hungry, it's also people in Canada, in remote communities, in northern communities that have limited incomes and very extremely high costs for food.
What is an obstacle is the perception that a treaty right cannot be used for commercial purposes. And these are the old ideas that we have to break down and destroy.
Fishermen used to be able to set 4 nets and get maybe 40 tubs of fish. Now they have to set 40 nets to get 4 tubs of fish. You know, that's been a total reverse. The flooding of the lake really affects our food chain as far as everything that we get off the land, and it's really damaged a lot of our hunting areas, our fishing areas, and even our berry picking areas.
They're being sent out and coming back with no legs or arms, toes, fingertips.
Virtually every fiber of policy in Canada, of the government, of the political and economic system, works against the food security of northern communities.
It has to go beyond the idea of supplementing the freight costs in the case of remote communities. It has to engage the people in the idea of food production to the extent they can in the climate in which they reside. So we need to get busy, growing our potatoes, our carrots, our vegetables in great numbers to sustain all our population.
So that's a little older, and it says Food Mail instead of Nutrition North, right? So there's been a bit of shift. But it's a 37-minute video with lots of participation of community members. So I sent a very small video, something like this, into communities, but with lots more voices, and asked, did I get the story right? And they told me. They would line up for hours to tell me the real story, what's happening. And the story changed from let's go gardening rah, 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 to looking at country foods and country food programs, as well as gardening and other things. So as we saw, very high food insecurity. So there's more severe food insecurity in these remote and fly-in communities than there is food security. I know Finesse has done studies in Manitoba and has also found high food insecurity, not as high because they didn't go to the fly-in communities. I specifically looked at these remote fly-in communities. So why is that? And I know my slides are going off the top, but that's saying prices in northern Manitoba are as high, or the highest price is actually from Red Sucker Lake, higher than in Nunavut. So why is that? It's only an hour by plane from Winnipeg to get up to Red Sucker Lake, maybe an hour and a half because it's the farthest community, compared to Nunavut, which is a lot farther. The food flies out of Winnipeg in both cases, and it's because of the store. In northern Manitoba, it's the northern store. And there is some competition in Nunavut, and they do have the Arctic Co-op, and that's a interesting cooperative model that I try to look at for Indigenous co-ops and how they plan, and you ask community what they want and try to provide those services. So, as you may not know, that half of Canada is missing connecting roads. So, here we are in the south. I'm sure you don't think of Thunder Bay as the south or Winnipeg as the south, but when you're in northern Manitoba, you start to think that Winnipeg is south. And not only does it not have connecting roads, it doesn't, in many of these communities, OPCN, Garden Hill, Red Sucker Lake, Wasagamak, they are lacking, many of the houses are lacking pipes for sewage and water. So they're getting cisterns, they're getting their water in green garbage bags, in containers, often, you know, and they're scop pails. They're still using scop pails. And I have students, I stay overnight. They have no electricity. They run it from a house next by, no washroom, no water. So just for 2 minutes, I'm going to ask you to do a thought experiment with me. Is how would you feel and what would you do if all of a sudden ground transportation networks broke down, and they're not going to be fixed in a few years. There's a major problem, and something's not going to be fixed in the next few years. There's few shiploads of food coming in from outside local area. The cost of food has suddenly skyrocketed 3 times the rate. The transportation system, the public transportation system doesn't exist, and the price of gas has gone up 3 times. You're on welfare, and practically everyone you know is on welfare. There's few jobs to be had. Suddenly, the jobs have disappeared. You don't own the house where you're staying. And in this city, you cannot keep chickens or turkeys. You can't use public spaces like parks for gardening and firewood provisioning. So you can't go to your park and cut down the trees. And the water and sewage system has suffered damage and is not working in your area and most areas nearby. So I want you to take the person next to you and for 2 minutes say what creative measures you're going to do to deal with these issues on a immediate basis. How are you going to survive? And politically, what are you going to do too? Any ideas? What would you do? Get chickens anyways? Yay. Okay. Any good ideas you want to share? Anybody? And could you do something with those emotions? Maybe change some rules around the politics of how things are run? Anything that came up back here? No? That you want to share? So coming together. So families and organizations like schools become very important then. Okay, great. So traditional foods. Any thoughts that come up? Go ahead. Mm-hmm. Fabulous. So the northern communities, many of the northern communities I work with and many people live in don't have running water, don't have sewage, don't have connecting roads. 3 times the cost for gas, 3 times the cost for food. So this is hardship all of you were experiencing that people live with on a daily basis. So I'm supposed to point it out here. So what we found when we surveyed these communities, we had a 500 plus survey of 14 communities, and we asked about food security. And then we put it into a statistical predictive model, looked at infrastructure, looked at traditional food use, and asked what is the connection with food security rates. And we found, to my great surprise, but maybe not to yours, is that country food programs came out as the highest impact for improving food security, more than roads, because some of these communities, like South Indian Lake, does have a road, more than public transit. Leaf Rapids had public transit. And if you had country foods program, roads, and public transit, you can have 95% food security. And that's better than the Canadian population, right? There's 91.9% food secure in the Canadian population. So country food program, this idea that rather than capitalism, that food sharing can be the best approach to deal with food security. And of course, these are culturally appropriate food. Nelson House was the model, had the best food security. And you can see the freezers. They pay fishermen and trappers to go out and hunt on the land and then share it with elders and single parents. And another example is they will, because there's not a lot of geese in that area, it's been, they've never come back after the problems around the 1950s where geese were almost extinct. They go all the way up to Churchill on train, and they bring back, which is about a 14-hour journey, and they bring back the geese by rail in a boxcar. So based on that, based on after the survey, a student went and worked with the area with the highest food insecurity, Opipina Piwin Cree Nation, which is also known as South Indian Lake. And it worked with the food champions, and it had lots of food champions in the area, and recommended, you have such high food insecurity, what about a food from the land program, a country foods program? And everyone chipped in. So the health center, the school. I'm having a hard time advancing these. There we go. So people donated freezers. People volunteered to prepare the food. The Big Sand Lodge, which is their economic development tool, they bring rich Americans up to hunt and take away the trophy antlers, but keep the meat, and they feed it to the community. They're feeding lots of people. It just started June that year, and it went up to 300 the same year that it was feeding. And it's a community of 1,200, so that's 1/4 of the community. And what was being distributed was fish. It's a fish-based culture, medicinal plants, and different varieties of fish eggs. And people love fish eggs there. Fish egg bannock, seasonal berries, whole fish, ducks, geese, moose meat. And everybody was chipping in. So including the Fishers and Trappers Association. So they were throwing in, and they were helping with supporting winter fishing activities, receiving moose, and educational programming. And educational programming was a big aspect. They started a credit course, a 55-hour credit course where they brought kids out in the land in 4 seasons to hunt and fish. So lots of hands-on workshops with youth. You can see them all. And it's always including elders. And it includes gardening, hunting, smoking fish, and berry picking. So duck and geese hunting, fish smoking workshop with elders. And they also, as well as the schoolwork, they include different campouts where they invite the whole community. And the one thing that really seemed to work to bring out youth engagement was they would always have talent shows as part of it. So there would be, like, I think my daughter won at $10 because she was part of 7 people doing a talent show. So they have not huge prizes of $100, but everybody in the community gets up to do their jigging, their dancing, their singing. It really was a great way to show the talent in the community. And that's bannock that they're roasting. So another big impact is gardening. It's not as big of an impact, but I'll just try to get back to that slide. Is here, it's the Grow North Churchill River Nursery. This is in Leaf Rapids. It's right beside OPCN, right beside meaning it's 100 kilometers away. But you can see there's OPCN people there. There's people from the PAW. This is a regional training grounds, and it has great facilities. So they took over what used to be a trailer park that has electricity, that has water, and they're planning it with now different bok choys, lots of Chinese vegetables that grow really well in the north, cabbages, for example. And they're trying to market garden, but also pay these youth, all of these youth training, and some of them are going on to be greenhouse technicians and trying to start a market garden of their own. And part of the work was to have this decolonization framework, was very important. Considering, here's a quote from McKinnon and Steffens, as the damage caused by colonization and oppression can have profound effects on self-esteem, sense of self-worth, self-confidence, and hope at the individual level, it can also lead to a collective weakening of social capital. Reversing the damage is slow but essential to self-empowerment, emancipation, and community transformation. And I don't know if you're familiar with this Circle of Courage model, but it's a lovely model that's used by a number of agencies. United Way is one of them. And it considers that programming should have elements of belonging, mastery, independence, and generosity. And we looked at this program, and it had elements of all those things. And it tried to incorporate that in the program so that we're not creating broken circles, we're creating whole circles that can go on. And this is a First Nations parenting model by Broken Leg. Matt? Oh, there we go. Oh. And the last picture was very funny, is because I asked people, the first one, I asked them to show their muscles, and all of them showed their big, big muscles. It's having a huge impact on their health, and it's visible. They're all very healthy after a whole summer. And this one, I asked them, okay, please show me your favorite vegetable. So some were Brussels sprouts. Can you believe it? Actually, I like Brussels sprouts. Kale. People came up with kale as a favorite vegetable, and we're acting it out here. So they're all acting out their favorite vegetable. That's why they look so silly. So it's changing diets, it's changing physical activity. Matt? There we go. The next project I'll talk about is, there's a fisheries co-op, and fishing goes on in the north. They all have co-ops. They don't really have bank accounts. They don't have lots of things associated with that, especially in the Island Lake communities, because there's no banks in these communities as well. There's no financial institutions. There's lots of people don't have credit cards. And I employed 4 people, and lots of them, they're counselors, none of them have social insurance numbers or any identity cards. So to get them into the university system was quite a feat. So we were working with the fishers and saying, well, you're complaining about never making any money and always being in debt and never being able to get started because you have no funds from the last year. So let's look at your operation, and create a business plan. And they needed one, actually. They came to us because they were in debt to the perimeter, this place to fly out the fish, and they weren't going to take the fish unless they had a business plan that showed they could be paid. So they came to us and said, can you do a business plan for us? And I was lucky. I had a wonderful student who did lots of international development, who took to the task and wrote an incredible business plan, researched how much money was being lost. And I had known that this was a priority area, sorry about that, because I had did food security surveys with 10, 12, 15 fishermen, and all of them were food insecure. So this was the biggest, most vulnerable group. They were catching fish, they were selling them for a loss, and they themselves were food insecure. And this was after them bragging about what good fishermen they were. They were all brilliant fishermen. It's just everything was so expensive in their communities, and the return rates were very, very low. So I won't play this commercial, but we created a commercial, we created a web page, and this is a lovely, you can Google Catching with Care and get this one. We had workshops, we created a web page to market the fish. We worked with Nietzsche Foods, and they were selling it, so we were creating a value-added product, which was a fish fillets to get a better price and to employ women. Women traditionally had filleted fish, but then the Freshwater Fish Marketing Corps came in and said, we're the only marketers of fish. We have a monopoly on fish. You can only sell to us, and you can't sell to the public. So we also with them, we got a special dealer's license for the community so they can sell within the community, and now they have a country foods program in that community. And we're selling at Nietzsche Commons. There's also a program that was existing long before we started, where they're giving fish nets to the community members, and they figured that had the biggest difference because each fish net fed 20 families for winter fishing. Then there is the consideration of food sovereignty, this idea that mines are taking over our communities, are destroying the food. And how can you have the right of people to healthy and culturally appropriate food through ecologically sound and sustainable systems? And this consideration that this was more like the traditional food system, right? It's living off the land, and that there was an abundance. And there's lots of ancient texts that show that there was so much food in every season. But there's a lot of disturbances. And government restrictions came out as number one, both in Manitoba and in BC. And then forestry, hydro, mining. So there's a number of developments that are causing difficulties and impairing use for food. So I'm involved with the land use traditional planning. So we're looking at how people hunt and fished in their communities. About 20 people from different communities, I guess 6 different communities, were trained with Terry Tobias, who's kind of famous, who's well known and probably the leading person in traditional land use. We created a video as part of it, but everyone was trained for 60 hours, really intensely, on how to do their own mapping in their communities and why they were doing it, and they wrote their own method and shared it between those 6 communities, which was quite a feat. And this is considering that First Nations community is limited by all the things we covered, reduced services, jurisdiction. First Nations federally controlled, but province controls resources. So the whole idea that how do First Nations take back their resources? And one way is through mapping to show that there's a strong traditional use, a current use of these resources, and that they have to be consulted, as well as develop their own land use plans, which will come out of this. And I just want to show you another video that was done that shows how how at-risk communities are. It's called Flooding Hope in Lake St. Martin. Did anyone hear about Lake St. Martin First Nation? How, this is almost the 4th year that they've been flooded out of their community and are displaced, and they're Canadian. So Matt, on the next slide, could you press the play? It's a short clip.
The old dress is not the same as I come home once again. There is no one left. I remember growing up, it used to be so nice here, so beautiful around here. But that will never be again. That will never happen again. Never.
Women would get together to prepare the fishing nets, and men made canoes for the fishers to catch fish with. After settlements started in the mid-1850s, the fishing industry provided an income for the Anishinaabe as well as sustenance.
Back in the 50s, 40s, when they used to go hunting, and they just had to go within the community to go get their moose deer. That's how abundant it was, and now we can't even find anything nearby.
Lake St. Martin was once home to the buffalo and other hunting and agricultural activities. People lived well and sustainably.
We are being evacuated from our community, and we were told we cannot take anything other than our very least bits of clothing.
In May 2011, Lake St. Martin First Nation Reserve was inundated by a devastating but avoidable flood. Lake St. Martin First Nation, a community of 2,000 people, was permanently displaced.
They want to do more hydro projects where they can make money on our water. Our lands are flooded while they make money on us. Now they're sitting back, and us, we're suffering. We're displaced from our homes. Like we're like refugees.
So, what are you supposed to live on now? We can't live here. We can't come back here. The land is no good anymore.
We've lost our traditional way of life, but we've also lost our culture.
The flood of 2011 at Lake St. Martin First Nation was artificial, but with real dire consequences. The community was displaced from their homes, losing their livelihoods, health, and socio-cultural integrity. The government chose to use the control structure to flood people with a deep history to the land.
So it's been 3 Christmases they've been out. And there's no resolution, there's no new reserve. Their reserve is completely underwater. So if I could advance. Next slide, please. Okay. So, and the thing is, they purposely, someone decided in the province to flood that community to save agricultural land. So they purposely did it, knowing that they have hundreds of years of history to that land, and that they're the poorest of the poor, that they have nobody, as a whole community, they're underwater and have very few other resources to go to other than that community. So there's been no charity that has stood up for them. There's been nothing that has really come out of it, unlike what happened in Alberta. So then getting this land and considering it in the broad scope of the right to food and what that means. And this has carried out kind of the first 3 steps of my research, is identify the hungry and the poor. The Food Security Survey did that, and focusing on the most vulnerable people, assessing policies, institutions, laws, and programs. And land is a real vulnerability, but also other things like country foods, Freshwater Fish Marketing Corporation, and then developing right space and what happened was community economic development strategies. So I think that's the end of my slides. There's one, maybe last one. So this is a critical issue in many communities, in many First Nations communities, definitely in northern communities. And this idea is so important to consider, to involve this freedom to support the right to food and decolonization and include that in our work. So thank you.
Okay, well, hello everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks for the invite to be here to share with you a little bit about some of the work that our Indigenous Health Research Group has been involved in over the past few years. This is actually great following Shirley's talk because it's just wonderful seeing just amazing things happening at the community level, and really this presentation is to a certain extent a celebration of that as well. It also, I think, hopefully we'll touch on a little bit of the conversation that took place this morning about implications of research. I will be giving this presentation on behalf of the Indigenous Health Research Group, which is it's really just a group of people, researchers at University of Ottawa, but we have some colleagues at Laval, probably maybe some new colleagues here at Lakehead, and really anyone that works with us connecting to Indigenous health. But it's a very multidisciplinary group. My background is ethnology. I study kind of the cultural processes around anything. Most of my work initially when I started was around hockey. I did work on First Nations hockey, actually. That's how I got connected, which I can talk a little bit about. But I worked with people who work in fields largely in the biophysical sciences, partly because of my position in health sciences at the University of Ottawa. And so this presentation really is the culmination of about close to 10 years of work with this particular group in a very multidisciplinary context. So let me see if I can advance this, which would be here. So for the, it is important that I talk about the project context and how this work started, so that at least give you a kind of a sounding board of really where we started as researchers and how we started doing stuff that I think has, more interesting implications for today's session. From this kind of understanding a little bit about the value of local food traditions, barriers to food procurement, collaborative action to increasing local food procurement, and increasing food access. I guess I can't see this thing. Perfect. Okay. So let me start a little bit about what we actually started as a group. And sorry, I wasn't sure I heard something there. Anyway, I'm hearing voices. This benefits, viability, risks approach is really something our group started, again, about 10 years ago. We started working with communities in Northern Ontario here, very similar to what Shirley was talking about in Northern Manitoba. Communities that you're probably aware of, and here in Northwestern Ontario. I started working a little bit in Sandy Lake, but primarily in the Wabekika First Nation, Casablanca, and Wabogabiwin, which are, again, remote flying communities, populations ranging from 17 in one community to about 900 in another one, but very small remote communities with limited access. The hockey stuff, which is something kind of interesting. Again, I was a researcher working in a kinesiology program, and I was doing studies of First Nations hockey as a kind of expression of cultural identity. During this work, visiting communities and playing hockey and hanging out in communities, one of the first things that people would do would be to take me on the land, go hunting and fishing, and I really don't know much about hunting or fishing, and I would just hang out with them and have the best time. It was like, me going to like Disneyland or something. It was amazing. And I think they liked me because I knew nothing about it, so I was kind of like their, mentally challenged little brother type of thing. Like they would take me out and explain everything to me, and it was just so exciting. And so I loved it, and I just started, getting to know people, developing friendships, and that's just kind of how the work started. But it also developed because as much as there was this really interesting pride and the associations with the land was so profound, there were all these kind of health issues that were going on. And one of the impacting stories that happened was my student and I, who was actually less of a hunter and fisher than I was, a city kid from Calgary. We were ice fishing with some guys in Sandy Lake, and there was a fish that actually, apparently, they call it mizai. It's actually a freshwater cod, a burbot. But anyway, the local guys didn't like to touch it. And we didn't know that. And in fact, it is a freaky looking fish. It's kind of got this weird back on. It kind of looks like an eel or something. And there's about 20 different local words for this fish. But when my student was on the ice sticking his foot on the head of the fish trying to take out the hook, one of our buddies says, we don't usually touch that fish. Starts laughing. We thought he was joking, and then he repeats it. So then I'm thinking maybe they don't really touch it. But anyways, we still grinded the hook and ripped it out of its gullet and killed the thing pretty well on top of the ice. And anyway, but they just left it there and left it for the wolves to eat. And so I went back home, and I work in health sciences at the University of Ottawa. And the first thing I did, and one of my buddies is a biologist, and I started telling him the story. And first off, he was just interested in the type of fish I was describing, but then it developed to the point of, wow, that's really curious. They don't eat it, they don't touch it. Wow, that's a burbot. That's a freshwater cod. It's this really tremendous food source, really. So we ended up writing the very first paper we wrote in this kind of multidisciplinary kind of science and culture meet paper was about this kind of local value traditionally of this food source, which the elders informed us was a valuable food source, that the liver would be procured specifically and prepared because of all these important fatty acids in the fish. But now, because of various different kinds of processes, that the kids don't even like to touch it, let alone eat it. So we wrote a paper about it, and that was the first kind of collaborative thing. And it developed for us kind of working from this very kind of science and culture perspective, trying to understand a little bit about these, the importance of kind of traditional food procurement, the importance of these foods, and kind of why there's been this dislocation of these things and its implications on community health. And again, I don't want to get you, I'm sure you all know the kind of the statistics on kind of the high burden of health problems in Indigenous communities, not just in Canada, but around the world. But it is something that, of course, people working in health sciences are very aware of. And so we were looking at traditional food models. So this long story basically sets up this slide. Basically, we wanted to understand what would be the impact of looking at people in these northern communities who actually eat more traditional food or more land-based foods versus people who don't and rely almost entirely on the store. And so we set up this kind of multidisciplinary research program that was funded initially by the National First Nations Environmental Contaminant Program to basically study really what was going on in terms of the extent to which traditional foods or land-based foods were actually still being consumed, understanding the preparation methods, the harvesting methods, what's involved. And this is the viability component to a certain extent. So, I mean, again, in southern Canada, even Thunder Bay, again, the point about being in Thunder Bay and talking about this at the south, I mean, talking about, well, people up north, they can just rely on the food, go on the land and get, eat traditional food. But there's so many implications, so much knowledge involved in it that this was something for us as researchers, and again, especially me, I think I was a good researcher going in because I really knew nothing about it. You know, traveling for 3 hours by Skidoo, then snowshoeing for another 2 hours, then walking with like pajamas because apparently my pants made too much noise, so the guys put pajamas over my snow pants. And apparently I should have been wearing snow pants because I was dying of heat and I complain all the time. So I'm like going, oh my God, I'm so tired. And just like, they're telling me to be quiet, I talk too much. And anyway, so we finally end up in this one spot and, then we're standing there. Some other guy apparently walked around and supposed to scare this moose back to us. And the guy beside me says, I think we're in the wrong spot. And I'm like going, oh, you gotta be kidding me, And apparently the moose was right behind us. And anyway, so after this, huge ordeal, we left with nothing. And we came home, we saw lots of nice scenery, but, no food. And so there's a lot more to it, especially people, again, there's machines, there's snow machines, there's boats. It's a hugely physically arduous thing. You need a lot of knowledge to know what you're doing. There's so much involved in it. Anyway, so that was very important for us for just one side of the study. The other component was this kind of clinical side of it. Once we kind of determined these types of practices, who ate what, kind of great grouping people, which I don't want to get into many details about kind of the assessments and how we did these groupings. But basically, we did establish through these communities this kind of grouping between people who eat more traditional versus not. So we did this clinical component, which my biophysical science friends aren't here to talk about, but they could bore you to death with all the wonderful things that they do. But basically, kind of doing various blood parameters to understand, for the most part, what the incidence of type 2 diabetes was, the various inflammatory markers, and also the extent to which people, basically their contaminant profiles, so what was in their blood in terms of environmental contaminants, primary PCBs and mercury. So, as a result, and again, I don't have time to kind of go through all the details of all of this, but these are just kind of two particular studies, and it comes back a little bit again to our discussion this morning about what is researchers. I've always felt we were community-based researchers in the sense that we do really work closely with communities. We have, this great rapport with communities. We like being there. Our students really benefited from it. We do feel that there's trust and all this kind of stuff, and so we felt we were doing community-based research. And so our results from the study were really quite disappointing in the sense that we didn't find any differences between people who ate more from the land versus people who eat from the store. In fact, what we found were overweight and obesity levels that basically were some of the highest in the world. So 98% overweight, nearly 70% were obese, 1 in 3 were diabetic. And it didn't matter which group you were, men, women, child, whatever, everyone, sorry, not child, it was 18 and over. So, but basically everyone in both groups there was no differences. Inflammatory markers, no differences. We could see no benefits at all in terms of at least the things that we were looking at between these two groups, which was, again, really shocking for us and also disturbing for us when we were given reporting back. In fact, the second paper, probably can't read this, but just came out just a couple months ago in PLOS ONE. But basically, it really identifies people who, the only difference we found was that people who ate more from the land were more contaminated. Okay, they had higher levels of PCBs and higher mercury. And some of the numbers were quite dangerous in terms of some of the levels, and it was not a good news story. And so this is something we reported back to the community, which again was, again, it's just something that as researchers, that's what our job is in terms of, conversations about, communicating results to communities. I think we do that very well. We're great at it. We explained it, I think, perfectly clear that this was not a good news story. But at the same time, what the communities kind of reported back to us was that they knew all this already, other than the contaminant burden, which is, again, a bit of an issue. But they really knew that they had problems with obesity. They knew that they were somewhat dealing with problems in terms of overweight and diabetic, and they knew all these things. And they knew that traditional food's important. And so we weren't really telling them anything new. So as a community-based project, this does very little. And so despite all our great efforts, and there was a lot of work in it, not a whole lot was really reported in terms of, at least from a community benefit perspective. And so what we can say, though, is that from the study, in which people in the room, I'm sure, are already aware, but I think it just needs reemphasizing, is that when we talk about benefits, this is something that I think we do need to get across, is that there are tremendous benefits to these foods, and the likelihood that we didn't see any difference is because the fact is that they simply don't have enough access to these foods. So a huge part of their diet, when we did all the dietary assessments, was that a huge portion of the diet, at least in these communities, was basically still from the store. Even if people said they identified mostly with traditional food, they still ate, a lot of their diet came from the store, and very low quality, highly processed foods, a lot of sugary beverages, sugar-sweet beverages, and things that were just really, it was a very poor diet overall. But that doesn't take away from the fact that people really did see the value in these foods. They wanted to get on the land, they wanted to eat these foods, and they saw all of these different things. And I'm not going to go through this whole list, I'm sure you're probably aware of them, but just this kind of intimacy with the land, with families, the fact that hunters are able to demonstrate knowledge and pride, and the food preparers, watching the grandmothers, the go-go's prepare the fish. Like, again, I was so amazed at it. Like, they'd be sitting there watching them. I'm sure they thought I had problems, but I would just sit there and stare. They could prepare fish so fast with their knives. They're like hammering fish and just throwing them through, and I'd be like watching them doing it like for 10 minutes, like trying to get all the bones, and it's just incredible. And there's so much pride associated with these types of traditions, these practices, and even younger kids seeing them in the teepee, watching food being prepared and watching, a truckload of geese come in, or if there is a moose that's brought in and seeing the carcass come in. There's so much kind of value connected to that. I'm just giving you some of the things, but I think it's important that, that there's much more even to that, aside from, of course, the nutritional benefits that we're all aware of. And so, again, the questions are, well, why aren't these things happening, I guess? And again, something that our research couldn't really answer. Again, you're doing research, answering questions, but for what? We've identified that traditional food's important, that, people want to eat more of them, but by the fact that there's so many costs associated with it, that people aren't able to get their kids on the land as much as possible anymore because of the costs. So, getting kids dressed in proper gear, it's so expensive. Traveling in terms of fuel costs, in terms of having the proper equipment. The knowledge, because of this kind of factors that people aren't training their kids, the residential schools, a whole bunch of other different things that have kind of disconnected people from the land. Life factors, someone might have a spouse or son who brings food in, but if that person passes away or moves, can be completely disconnected and their food access has changed. The availability, there's so many issues around availability, different migration patterns, ice changing in terms of melting earlier, flooding, all these different factors. There's so many things going on why these things are happening, which are impacting people's ability to get these locally available or somewhat available foods, these traditional foods. Okay, and so what we did, luckily, again, seeing that this whole kind of moving beyond research, we were able to get this really amazing kind of opportunity, and I'm not too sure if people are familiar with the Coalitions Linking Action Science for Prevention, but basically it's an initiative or a program that is developed through the Canadian Partnership Against Cancer. And it was something that I didn't really even understand when we first started moving forward in the first CLASP proposal. But it really was this kind of an opportunity by the Canadian Partnership Against Cancer that provided researchers, policymakers, and practitioners to come together to apply for funding to really do things that have impact at various levels in terms of dealing with chronic disease prevention. We were asked as our group to be participating in a particular grant called Collaborative Action Against Childhood Obesity. The aim ultimately was to kind of deal with the complex multifactorial issues of obesity, and our group dealt very specifically with Indigenous populations in Northern Ontario, the communities. We had quite strong relationships for about already close to 10 years or 7 years at the time, and we basically moved forward on this grant application. We were successful, and really this grant, in a nutshell, provided kind of money for communities to develop their types of local food procurement initiatives, and primarily around traditional land practices. So it could be money to develop for skidoos, for elders to train young people, for anything that basically would work to help this type of initiative. It was quite successful, and we then basically were applied for a second round of this. It's called CACO 2, so it's the Collaborative Action Against Childhood Obesity 2. So it's a second round of CLASP funding, which basically, oops, I'm going to bring this back for a sec. Hopefully this works. Is it possible to bring that back to that last map? Yeah. So this is again the good things and bad things about funding though. The funding, in order for us to get the second round of funding, we needed to expand beyond our Ontario kind of comfort zone. It had to be in different regions, and so because we were giving presentations like this, other communities across the country did approach us and were interested in kind of doing these kind of community initiatives to develop their local food procurement programs. So now we've developed the programs in 9 different communities. We work in British Columbia, in Yukon, Northwest Territories, and in Ontario, and really all with the goal of the communities coming forward to us with their community-based project plans, and our role as researchers as more facilitators to try to make those programs work. So it's a very different kind of thing. To me, this is really what community-based research should be about, and what we as researchers doing work in community settings should be doing is working from what the communities are coming to for us, and we basically respond to that which is a very inverse relationship when typically you see a grant application, you see it, oh, well, let's see if a community partner would be willing to work on it. So this whole relationship ultimately changes. But again, it is part and parcel with this kind of CLASP initiative, which again moves beyond just doing research and working for kind of these more kind of development types of initiatives. So basically, this CLASP initiative, we're working towards food sovereignty, was the idea that we were going to support these types of projects, build capacity, whether communities wanted to do community gardening, whether they wanted to do traditional food practices, whether they want to work on food distribution methods, whether they wanted to work on importing foods into their community, however they wanted to do it, however they wanted to design it. They came to us with a project plan. All 9 communities did that, and then we kind of helped facilitate these things happening at the community level. So enough about that. I want to go to the communities really quick. So how much time do I have about? Sorry? Just a few minutes? Perfect. No, but I have hours to talk about. Anyway, so I'll just quickly go through this. But there's only 4 communities. I'm just going to kind of quickly go through. In Kikatla, for example, in British Columbia, an amazing community. Kind of their programs are working with youth, primarily around youth, on traditional food procurement. They're also doing community gardening, which is an interesting kind of thing because it's an island. They're bringing in topsoil in order to make the gardens work. But this kind of emphasis on not just simply, getting the food in, but really training, working with elders and youth, this very intergenerational approach to help kind of build this idea of sustainability by giving the kids the skills and the knowledge to basically get out and do that. These things will carry on. In Kwan Dun, this is an interesting community. The fact that their participation was really based on, they had developed this a mental health kind of land-based healing program that they've just received funding from Health Canada for 3 more years to basically look at these kind of land-based practices to deal with the various assortment of mental health issues in the community. We're helping support those initiatives more on the food procurement side, but then trying to understand what impact this is having in terms of health from a much more kind of holistic perspective than just simply what it does in terms of food and nutrition. I was hoping that Clara was going to be here from the Wekika First Nation. Clara is an amazing person. People probably here already know her. Food champion. She's a counselor on the community on Band Council, and she's just been leading things that are honestly just will blow you away. Developing a community garden within 3 years ago, I think was the first time. They didn't even know they could develop or grow the things that they did. Listening to the stories firsthand about eating fresh vegetables and fruit. It's doubled in size. You go in where there used to be just simply carcass and kill in one of these kind of rooms, and now she's got little seedlings all over and garden books and stuff. Amazing, amazing story. But again, developing it with as an intergenerational program. They've also taken some people who have gone through addiction problems in terms of the prescription drug problem, and have taken them on the land as a detoxification strategy. Again, a mental health thing. But again, all of these things happening at the community level. We're not the ones doing it. Next slide. So Fort Resolution, again, very similar stories. Just mentioned here, they've really targeted their programs to the schools to make sure the food distribution is happening at the school level, so kids are getting access on a very regular, at a regular level. But again, bringing in kind of traditional foods, locally harvested foods into the program. So again, just tremendous success. So I'm just going to finish with this kind of last slide, and I think it's just kind of an important takeaway. Because really, ultimately, what you're seeing, and also I guess what Shirley was presenting earlier, is that what you're seeing is just incredible things happening in communities. And unfortunately, to a certain extent, a lot of this stuff is happening in silos. I didn't even know, what Shirley was doing, so it's great to hear your presentation. But these are things that are happening, and there's such incredible things. We hear so many about flood and very disastrous types of kind of problems that are happening, but there's so many great stories that are happening. And these initiatives are happening with very little. And I think we already know that these, by kind of the evidence that you've heard here, is that these things, there is uptake. And I think this is something, obviously, that needs to be supported. There needs to be supported to get these things moving forward with very little, I think, in terms of support, financial support and resources, to at least build this kind of starting point that communities can become autonomous in terms of the direction they're going with their food strategies and food plans. For us, an interesting kind of research question. Again, I am a researcher, and I think we're interested, though, how this translates ultimately to behavioral change around food intake. How does this ultimately mean, just simply saying, well, now there's food access, there's more food access, will people eat better? will this have an impact on chronic disease? And so this ultimately becomes a research question that we're now working with communities on their success, those who have been developing food plans and having developed successful strategies. We are trying to figure out, how can we measure what impact this is having? And one of the things we are really focusing on is this behavioral change, trying to do the best job we can in terms of understanding food intake. And then we do expect if we do see changes there, we will see metabolic change as well. This kind of working with communities is obviously a huge thing, that this is not just one particular issue that we can just say, well, it's an economic issue, we can change it. This is multifactorial. This isn't going to happen overnight, but I think working with communities is showing very progressive and positive first steps. So anyway, sorry if that was a bit long, but anyway, I'm a prof, can't stop talking. Okay.
So I want to thank you for inviting me. My name is Joseph LeBlanc. I'm a PhD candidate at Lakehead University. I'm also very active in food system and as a volunteer and running True North Community Cooperative. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my research. I'm going to divert a little bit into the co-op and into social enterprise, but generally speaking, on the concept of Indigenous food sovereignty. This is something that I've been involved in forever. Essentially, my grandfather was one of the last farmers in our community and lived in a system that we would call this sort of reciprocal or sharing system, right? He was never hungry, but he was never rich, and he was never selling his food, he was sharing his food. Or the tree that falls down and, make me cut it up and bring it to the old ladies that, still use wood stoves and stuff. So, that when I started to work in the forest sector, I really saw this disconnection, right, between the people who live there and what is needed and what was happening in natural resource management. So I started my PhD with the Airland First Nation, and really naive, I come and I say, I want to study caribou, and people say, well, we don't really eat caribou anymore, and everyone has a collar on it, and everyone that we take, the M&R comes and they come and take it, or they come and look for that collar, and people are putting collars on dogs, and they're doing all kinds of stuff to avoid this. But it really led to that question of what's really going on here, right? And there is this high level of food insecurity. There are strong traditions, and as the previous speakers have talked about, right? This tradition of acting this way, it comes with health, right? And this loss of not acting that way comes with ill health. So we started to look at that broad concept of what is happening here, what's going on here with natural resource management and food insecurity or the economy of the community, right? And the truth, we're going to position this in truth and in context. We're operating on lands that the authority to do so comes from the treaties, right? So often this discussion happens within the framework of treaty and Aboriginal rights and natural resource management, and the jurisdictional divide was discussed already, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But really, that jurisdictional divide is sort of inaccurate in that the authority to create that division in the first place came from us, came from these agreements that passed title that gave the authority to create something called Canada, something called Ontario, and something called the M&R, and something called hunting regulations, right? And the ability to spray herbicides arbitrarily or do these things without consulting treaty partners. So I do like to start this conversation by reminding everybody that we're all treaty people, right? Ontario expressing their treaty rights in establishing hunting regulations for Ontarians, right, shouldn't be removed from the discussion of the treaty rights of Indians, status Indians in this case. Unfortunately, that's the word we're using, but and then also Aboriginal rights and inherent rights that exist with Indigenous people. So the work that I've been doing primarily is in our own community, Northern Ontario, and I'm going to look at this question of what's really going on, right? And so we start to look at these deliberately imposed changes that created the state of food insecurity. Right now we look at these high rates and we look at how do we address these things. But those things didn't happen in a vacuum, right? We didn't end up in these places because we chose to go there. We was put there because there's the Hudson's Bay Company there, or it's non-desirable land, or it's some place to stick somebody because it's close to a mill. For example, in Arrowland, they settled that area because of the Arrowland Forest Company. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this. We have a paper that's coming out in a collected book on this topic in particular, but contact and trade started to influence the philosophy and the interactions between people, right? And just to break it down, basically this system of reciprocity and mutual respect that existed before was greeted with mercantilism at the time, and later capitalism and an extractive perspective that didn't include that reciprocity, that didn't include that responsibility to pay back what you took, right? And so I really do think in the first contact that happened there, that introduction of that concept of taking without giving back was a really harsh lesson that people learned, right? And resulted in the type of trade and exchange of economy that we see now. And we see, not to bash the sponsor, but that type of behavior where it's an exploitative relationship, right? In our northern communities, they're taking without giving back, right? So the Act for Gradual Civilization of Indians started to define what an Indian was, right? And starts to create that division to say, this group here is different and this group here is different, right? And in doing that, they didn't change too much when they changed the name of the act, right? The intent is still there, and we know that. We're living with it now, and we're dealing with the implications of that. Very much the intent still is that gradual civilization, right? That behaving in a specific way is okay and recognizable from a Western perspective, but changing the name didn't change the intent. The Constitution Act, and Shirley talked about the division of responsibility or jurisdiction, really has provided that pass the buck kind of environment that happens, right? And we say, lands are managed by M&R. Unless those lands are reserved for Indians, then it's in the federal jurisdiction, right? But that didn't deal with our right to access those resources, right? And the right to be able to live in the way that we used to live or needed to live to be healthy and well. The treaties and the reserves started again to delineate, who falls into which category and where they're supposed to live and what that means when they live there. And you did a really good way of breaking down what some of those constraints are, right? I've heard people say, well, we can't cut down trees and build our own house. Well, why not, right? The M&R is not there. They're not telling you right away, don't cut that tree down. But it's inside, right? It's inside our minds, and it's there. Those barriers, they may not be active. The Indian agent isn't there anymore, but there still holds that barrier to say, well, I can't really go over there and make a log home, right? But, some communities are, and some people are doing that. But the reserve system, again, like I said, deciding where that goes wasn't based on the ability to be mobile on the landscape. And, elders talk about being born in a good place, being born at a lake or somewhere else, and being moved to static communities. That static community means that we now become like a point source, right? We have to travel onto the land, and again, intersecting with Michael's presentation, there's high costs involved in that, right? Instead of being able to go and live where there are fish at the time when there's fish there, and go and live where there are blueberries when there's blueberries there, and go and take a moose down and then move to that moose and process that moose and in that place now is dealt with quads and snow machines and trucks and all of these things, and in some extreme cases with float planes and helicopters, right? And so there's a high cost as a result of this imposed change that happened in saying you have to live in this specific place. Residential schools, we could talk at length about the impacts of residential schools, but in relation to food, the displacement of children from the ability to participate in and observe food production activities But also going beyond that sort of mechanical part of processing, harvesting, finding food, seeing how people interact with each other and care for each other, right? That's what I talked about with my grandfather and being responsible for all of these people that were extended family and other things. You know, our chief said, well, we really miss your grandfather's food now that he's dead, but you know, nobody really went to learn from him when he was alive, right? And so that missing piece of, you know, it's not the store closing, it's, you know, the farm closing or where food comes from. So that missed opportunity, right, is a serious intergenerational problem, right, where we've lost that sort of experiential learning opportunities, but also gardens were used as punishment for the children, right? And hard labor in the garden was equated with different infractions, and you know, that's not really a good way to learn how to enjoy gardening or have the mental health outcomes that we see in research and what we would expect from that behavior. So not only removal from the practice of doing it, but also removal from, you know, the experience of the outcome of the practice, but also these negative sense memory that's been created in entire generations that say, you know, don't want to do it for fun when they were punished with it as children. Right? Oligopolization of the imported food market was very deliberate, and there were very close relationships between the Hudson's Bay Company and the federal government. That monopoly or oligopoly was created on purpose and extends into the freight companies as well. And some of our work that we do with True North now, we deal with that regularly in shipments to northern communities. We have, you know, 2 trucking companies to choose from that service points of access. Well, they make you sign a waiver that says if they damage your food, it's not their fault. So you put it on the train, and they make you sign a waiver that say, you know, if the skid gets bashed in the car, it's not our fault. And then, you know, you go to the airline companies, there's 2 or 3 to choose from, and they're all the same price, right? And so this oligopoly or monopoly that exists with northern stores extends out, and they have strong connections as well with those shipping companies. You know, there's connections to the freight companies, there's connections to the Pepsi bottling, and you know, it's something that unfortunately was created around us, and we have to live with the negative impacts of it. And finally, mass media. There's with the introduction of satellite television and cable and now cellular phones and cell towers into remote communities, it's changing the way that youth view food and what they're exposed to, right? And we've seen that with community members that come down, and kids want to go to McDonald's, they want to go to Pizza Hut, they want to do these things. And now, even more so, the Northern's bringing them in, right? And so we've got KFCs in remote communities. We've got the fun-to-go markets and these things that are bringing processed foods right to us, right? And so when we ask that question, what's going on, there's a lot going on here, right? It's not just about the M&R that decides to take that caribou from people. It's not just about the M&R who decides to spray that. It's a systemic, not just marginalization, displacement, right? And then we look at some inclusive management regimes that, you know, pull us into the margin, but it's still not focused. So these are pictures from Airland's traditional territory that were taken with community members that we hired youth to do it. We went through training youth to interview elders and partner with elders to do traditional land use mapping. All of those maps exist in the community, and we took this sort of food basket approach, plan for the food system first, and then development around that. But these are some of the things that people were taking pictures of that we wanted to discuss, right? And starting to look at, you know, the life of the land, the spirit of the land. This top left corner, you know, it's not uncommon, it's pretty clean. But this is stock tree production, right? And I don't know, you know, what a caribou thinks, but I think, you know, standing in that, it wouldn't feel good. It wouldn't feel normal. Our moose at the bottom, you know, these sprayed sites have basically nothing on them, right? They're going to have stock trees and grasses and stuff, but, you know, she's supposed to be eating twigs and leaves and things that we know, but, you know, when it's not there, these are the food of our food, right? And how do we care for those things and ensure that they're there? Herbicide spraying, I don't know if we have a pointer here. No. Herbicide spraying, we've seen this on the landscape, but this type of signage that goes up, that sign, and maybe it's not clear from here, but it actually has no dates. It has no indication of what's supposed to be there is not there. And it went up 2 days before the spray, which is again against policy. But these are happening in the far north, the far reaches, where the M&R has been cut so bad, there's nobody watching what's happening. And so actually went at that site, there were pickers in there. They were told to get out. The plane flew over, and the contractor say, okay, you can go back in, right? They didn't, obviously, but that attitude where, herbicides are safe and Monsanto told us so, we're gonna apply them in tens of thousands of hectares a year, unfortunately in blueberry season very often because it's the time of year when it's done. So you see the impacts here of herbicides on the production of blueberries. It doesn't actually kill the plants very much. It reduces production for 3 years. But what we talked about with community members was this idea of contamination, right? And when I went there with my idea about caribou, they put it into reality and said, we want to look at these 4 thematic areas. One was wildlife management. So we looked at moose hunting in the community, and as you may know, moose numbers are dropping drastically here. It's not that they're necessarily being overhunted, it's that the M&R doesn't count Aboriginal harvests. So when they allocate tags, right, they're not looking at the biggest data set, right? So this was some of the first surveys that were done in this area, and we figured there was a 40% error in the number of moose that the M&R were saying were coming out. So now we come to 5 years later, and they've reduced the tags in Ontario by 88%, right? So that's what's going to happen if you don't count the biggest user group, right? But it's a very politically contentious issue. The most logical thing to happen is not to reduce Aboriginal harvests, but to reduce the tags that are allocated to recreational users. So the other issues we looked at, like I say, were contamination and people's use of the land and perceptions of contamination, right? So the data will say that harvesting, or that spraying, the half-life of the chemical, it's gone in 3 months, right? So, but it's killed most of the plants there, and that's what people are concerned about. They're not concerned as much about the chemical being there when they eat it. They're mostly concerned that there's no blueberries there anymore, and that's a significant change forever. So we started to look at this concept of economic development. The other theme that the community wanted to do was find a way to market the resources that were around them, to participate in natural resource economy. Now, natural resources in Ontario are managed as a zero-sum game, right? The best example for this is the wood allocation that happened 2 years ago. There's a competition for available wood supply, but the competition pitted neighboring communities against each other, right? There's only one winner, everybody else loses. So when this community in particular put in their application and the other one gets it, that means people from the other community come over and harvest in their land base, and they get nothing. And so this boom and bust cycle, people are really tired of that, right? And we need to find something that balances the profit with the people who are there, right? We talk about shared opportunity, not leaving us with the mess or the share of the profits after, but shared opportunity. This is cut and scaled logs in the Ogoki Forest, which is a restricted access forest north of Airland, that were never picked up by the mill. So when you stand there, you can hear the beetles eating them, and the community was hired to harvest those and were never paid. So, I'd prefer to see those standing there, right, and be moose habitat and where there's blueberries growing, but this unbalanced leaves that community not only not being paid, but also with the costs, bearing the costs of what they put in to do that harvesting. So that's not uncommon. When the mill shuts down, it doesn't use all the supply that it has and then shut down. It just shuts down. That means everything in the supply chain, including cut logs that are sitting on the side of the road, stop dead right there, and that's it. So we started to look at the concept of life projects. Life projects, this is a really great book, by the way. It's available free online. It's called In the Way of Development, and it highlights indigenous life projects in South and Central America and North America as well. So this concept of, our economy being anti-development is not accurate, right? We're not necessarily anti-development. Like I say, we want a share of the opportunity. So it really does a good job of discussing, is it and or versus industrial development. Oops. So out comes the Airland Youth Blueberry Initiative. In 2008, we started essentially with a purchase of about 12 baskets, very small, and I came down to the market and I sold them in 5 minutes, and they say like, well, there's something here, right? And Airland has a lot of blueberries on their reserve, which is unique because they cut a big part of the reserve, but they didn't reforest or spray or do anything silvicultural to return that forest. So there's a lot of blueberries there. And we started to look at, how do we build economic opportunity that was shared, right? Private enterprise doesn't facilitate that, and some community members had tried that where they would buy from people and then go drive down to Thunder Bay, but there's huge risk involved in that. It's about 4 hours. What happens in the food system is generally you push down the price on the primary producer, and so pickers weren't wanting to do that and pick for next to nothing. So we built a nonprofit buying depot that's run by Youth Council, over time now there's 5 other buying depots in the community. In 2012 we did a sort of a vague assessment, and it's worth about $250,000 between those 5 buying depots, and that's about a 4 to 6 week season, right? Pickers are paid in the community. The blueberries are bought in the community, and they're marketed throughout the region collectively. And so, we have an opportunity to experience all of these wonderful things that come from traditional activities and participating on the land-based intergenerational opportunities, but also to build a market. And really, if you're from Northwestern Ontario, you'll know Airland's blueberries. They're available everywhere that will have us. So in doing that, though, we started to hustle around selling blueberries, right, and try to find grocery stores to buy it, and they say, well, no, we buy from head office or centrally buy at the food terminal, or we have a contract with, the state of Maine to buy their blueberries or whatever. So it's really just finding a niche within that. But started interacting with farmers more and more, right, and they experienced the same thing, right, which is push the price down as much as possible. We can't get in to sell where we're coming from. So we came up with the True North Community Cooperative. And True North is a nonprofit, community-based co-op. We were incorporated in 2009. Airland was our first producer member. We have over 100 producer members now who control their pricing. So, it's based on what the producer needs to be viable. We have a storefront here that operates 6 days a week. We sell Airland's blueberries frozen all year and fresh in the summer. It's about 1/10 of our income as a whole, and so then we started getting into more of like a personal relationship with people, right? It's being a part of the cooperative is being a member and having a vote and being equals with others, and so we started to sort of spin off into some other things. And in 2011, I was invited to Fort Albany to participate in the community food security workshop. And what they had been doing is running, volunteers in the community had been running alternative market for a number of years. And seeking other suppliers, because really the way that grocery stores and Timmins and other places were treating them, they were looking for something else. And it just happened that Nutrition North was open for applications at that time when we applied to do that. So True North is actually the only nonprofit southern supplier in Nutrition North. We started with Fort Albany and made a relationship with the Ontario Food Terminal to sell fresh fruits and vegetables there. Since then we've now expanded to 6 other remote First Nations, and so we're supplying pretty well up the coast and into Wapakika and Winneman Lake. So, that process was part of the initial visioning of the co-op, but really was steered there by our members, right? And start to look at how we can share that opportunity, right? And I think that's a founding principle here. We've also now spun off into some research, and some of that came through my PhD, where we were looking at the concept of wild game, or traditional foods, and really not finding a terminology that fit that, right? Like, they're not wild. We're operating in managed forests that are sprayed and harvested, and there's a lot of activity on Crown lands, and it's not game, right? And when you talk about it as traditional values, and you do land use planning, and you start to interact with the M&R, they think old stuff, right? Like where your grandfather harvested, where their trapping cabins were, and it really didn't capture that. Like right now, this is a food source, right? And so we coined the term forest and freshwater foods, and very happy to see that as part of Ontario's Local Food Act. It was included just this fall, and started our forest foods research project. We start to look at what is the value of forest foods to Northern Ontario. And last summer with Ontario Nature, we did a survey with over 600 respondents. We published a report that was 80 pages, and then put that out for public review and sought public comment on that. And then finally this March published that paper. So it has some of the first data of what the value of these foods really are. So I just wanted to finish off talking about the concept of actionism. I was asked to talk a little bit about these projects and the impact on food sovereignty. For me, just as decolonization is inherently anti-colonial, right? Indigenous sovereignty is inherently anti-crown sovereignty, right? And in this work, life projects are not capitalist projects. They're not social enterprises in the way that we would see them from a Western perspective. They very much are about sustaining life in place, right? That includes place-based education, as we talked about, intergenerational learning and restoring some of those interactions that happened, participatory research and engaging community members as researchers, and I talked a little bit about that, social entrepreneurship and what we did with the Blueberry Initiative, and community organizing, and really basing this work on community strength. So this 4R strategy, it really speaks to what we're doing, right? Reclaiming our sovereignty. That starts with renaming places, right? Reorganizing, right? Like the example of the co-op or the Airland Youth Blueberry Initiative. Those were things that were not organized before to do these things, right? And so reorganization is a critical part. Reskilling, right? Some of this, like I mentioned, the impacts of gardening at the residential schools, but that also includes how we interact with each other. It's about teaching the kids how to not only buy from people in their community and treat them with respect, but also come down to the farmers market here in Thunder Bay and engage with people and share their story. And really, I think they've shared more about herbicide spraying than I've seen anywhere else, right? And in just interacting with people, right? And people say, well, have these been sprayed? Well, no, because they wouldn't exist if they were sprayed. But, did you know that, spraying is still happening all over Ontario, even though it's banned in urban centers? And then finally, rebuilding. And I use this image of an engine, right? And one of the community members I was working with, he was an airplane mechanic, and he started talking about this concept of an engine, right? And the concept of community energy or outside dollars getting that engine going again, right? As the traditional economy is there, right? It's still sitting there. Some pieces, they need to be reorganized and tweaked a bit and rebuilt a little bit, but it can function again, right? And we've seen it function again when sometimes some outside dollars, hire a coordinator and it gets running, and those funds run out and then it stops running again. But, this concept of community energy being the driving factor is really where we'll find sustained change and a transition towards that reclaimed sovereignty. So I'm just going to leave my contact information. Unfortunately, I won't be here for dinner tonight. I have to go get my kids. But if anybody wants to talk, let me know, and I'll be around for a little bit more.
Sure, and if you guys have questions of each other, we can start that way too. That's great. Is it on? Just turn the button.
I was interested in the concept of the communities bringing hunters in to hunt. One of the communities we were looking at is struggling with the M&R's tag system, right? Is to say, like, we don't really have the opportunity to invite tourists in to hunt and say you can take 5 moose or caribou or whatever. So is that just a jurisdictional thing in Manitoba, or how are they able to allocate those?
Sandy Lake Lodge is part of South Indian Lake, or OPCN, and it was their economic development money that they spent when they were compensated poorly for the flood. So these are fly-in. Sandy Lake is very remote. It's caribou country. And so the tourists come in, but they can't fly out with the caribou. So they take the antlers with them. They definitely eat caribou while they're there. And it's a well-stocked lodge in terms of it's got a meat grinding machine, it's got a butchery, so it can do everything there. Everything the First Nations Reserve doesn't have, it has. And so, but they'll get 5 moose and more caribou a year, and mainly moose actually, and bring it down in the fall. So that's something that occurs every fall, and they can count on it. But the tourists can't take them. So they can take the antlers and they can take a picture, but they can't take the actual meat, which is wonderful for the community because that's the most favorite food of the community, and that's what they love. And I have some in my freezer, I should say. It's good. It's the best quality meat you could taste.
I don't need it. Oh, yes, I do. Oh. Okay. Dr. Michael, you were talking about your research and the next phase of your research. When is that going to start?
Okay, so we're in the process of just finishing the class funding. So we're applying for funding now through Canadian Institute of Health Research and Heart and Stroke Foundation. So they're 2 separate applications. Really, with the next step with the communities, obviously trying to see, okay, so based on the things that you've done with your food plans, with the activities that you've set up, let's try to make a stronger case now that these things work. Because we've researched that they're happening. I mean, that, there's great testimonials, we have descriptions of the activities that are happening. We've even, we're documenting how the food is being distributed to the community throughout. But what we don't really know is, well, once it's being distributed, what's actually being consumed, first off, in a very kind of thorough way. And then if these food behaviors are changing, what's its impact then on their health? And so we would do very basic blood parameters to, again, look at inflammation, fatty acid profiles, just various measures that you can look at to see any changes in terms of health status.
This is more of a comment. I want to keep in touch with all of you, actually, but I don't know if you're going to be here for my presentation tomorrow on what I did,
Yep.
But I'm only one person and my doctor at St. Michael's Hospital who took my blood tests every 3 months and videoed it for the documentary that I did. He stated in a newspaper article that although my hyperlipidemia cleared without medication and I lost weight without working out and I ate more than I ever have with regards to indigenous foods, whether it's organic, wild, or just regular no-frill stuff, that I'm only one person in one study, but it works, right? To me, that I don't need somebody, a professional, to tell me it changed my life, to go back to eating as much as I could as my native North American ancestors. So I'd really like to keep in touch with you about that, because basically you said I'm one person, and in order to consider it a study, he needs more people, right? And I'm having a really hard time finding people to go on this journey with me, so.
Yeah, and it's an amazing kind of, I've been reading about your feats and what you've been doing, and I think it's an amazing kind of commitment, and it's very exemplary for, I think, a lot of people, very inspirational. And I'm sure you probably know of Jay Wortman, I mean, some of the things that he was trying to do in similar contexts, and I'm the wrong person to say about, you know, how nutritionally sound or even to comment on that side of it. My comment more is on, I would like to see you come to communities to inspire the behavioral aspects to motivate people to make the types of changes, whether it's following a more of indigenous type of food plan or just simply start being able to consume healthier foods, connect with those things that foods brings, and at the community level, that's what's huge, and I think that's even more so the impact that you might have in terms of other people from my perspective, so I think that's great.
I agree with you. Thank you.
So this is another question for Shirley, but kind of related to discussions I've had with Joseph earlier on. So you had talked about fishers who were able to develop their own abattoir so that they could then cut up their own fish and sell it. Is that?
Yes.
How did that happen? Because one of the things that we find really difficult in Northwestern Ontario in particular, through the Food Mail and now Nutrition North, is that communities can't sell foods to each other, right? That it actually has to go to a licensed abattoir, which is either Nunavut or to a southern point, right? And so it becomes very difficult and really expensive to transfer food between communities. And so I'm just wondering how that's, like maybe the rules are different in Manitoba, like how did that?
No. So there aren't. In fact, I had a student who was a public health inspector who used to shut down even for serving fish in these fishing communities in the schools. And this is the highest pediatric diabetes in Ojibwe Cree communities, in the Island Lake communities. So there were no fish, there was no local fish being served on treaty days, any public events where there were outsiders or where they could shut a kitchen down, not served at all. And instead of these very expensive processed foods were served. So what we had to do was we got a special dealer's license. We went to the Freshwater Fish, which is a monopoly, which gives out all the which buys all the fish and markets it. And so, you know, there's a clear problem with that they're the only ones that can give out these licenses. But we got one based on video, based on proving that this is a very food insecure group in a study. And so they're allowed now to sell anywhere in Manitoba fish and to process the fish. So we can smoke fish as long as it's done in a commercial kitchen. And that's not easy to get either. So we had to use the high school kitchen. But we're trying to, over the winter road, we brought up a 3-basin, sink. So we're trying to develop a commercial kitchen in the health center so they can serve completely for all their diabetes patients, for all their events, and they serve 20 to 50 people a day too. So there's 2 places where we've asked them to invest and at least provide 10% of their menu to be fish, but the health center will do much more than that. And then the next step, we got a very small grant, it's not gonna be enough, to turn their processing plant, which isn't a processing plant, it's a packing plant. All it does is put ice on fish and pack it out into a processing plant. And so that's in the works. We do have a business plan for that, so we'll develop it. But because we're working based on priorities in the community, which is food security, is we're trying to feed all the people first, and then realize that if we're gonna send it out, we would love it to be smoked, or we would love it to be filleted, so that we could employ more people in the community and even pay the bills, you know, which right now they're not paying the bills, and fishermen are very food insecure. So we did, with Nietzsche Foods, we were able to sell to them, and we just broke even, which was a huge accomplishment. It never happened for years and years and years. It was crazy that the band and the fishermen were subsidizing the Winnipeg market when they were indeed food secure themselves. So, yeah. So as for meat, that too isn't served in the schools. However, Nelson House is a very strong, politically strong community in Manitoba, and it has as a counselor a person who used to be the manager for Manitoba Conservation. So they know all the rules, and they work well within and without the system. And even if the public health inspector wants to shut them down, they don't shut down. So they see themselves as their own traditional territory, and that they don't have to respond to these outside forces. Whereas other communities don't see themselves that way. So it was really, they're a really good model for other communities too.
Thank you.
If I could ask a question around the True North Community Co-op. So you mentioned 100 producers, and it's funny because we started with a fish co-op, and people came up to us and said, okay, you're helping them, and their fishermen are sometimes very difficult to work with. Lots of problems. We're much easier to work with. We're artists. We'll get along. And so it just worked like that, where one person saw you doing something in the community and said, hey, we've got this other project. And in Garden Hill, they have natural soapstone, and they have wonderful artists, crafters. So I just would love to know the story of how it worked from blueberries to 100 producers.
The first year we started trading a lot. Like we set it up in a really accessible way. So we were the first mixed member co-op in Ontario. That means producers, consumers under the same umbrella, right? Typical cooperatives are producer co-ops or consumer co-ops, and this was a blend. And so, it was new for people, for sure. People were like, because we were basically operating on consignment. You take your stuff and we'll sell it and we'll pay you at the end of the month. So people were a little hesitant with that. Airline's initiative was, we had trust and we were operating largely in the same way. So we started trading, and it's like really easy to turn blueberries into potatoes and meat and other things that farmers had, and they don't have time to go pick blueberries. And so we were trading, 18 baskets for a significant amount of potatoes. Like, I was quite surprised. And when you operate on that way of, I guess it's mainly mutual respect, but to say like what you value your thing at and what we value our thing at are maybe not the same, right? So we have a whole bunch of blueberries, but for somebody who was going to go buy that, that's like $30, $35 a basket, right? And so if we started in that trading relationship, and we quickly populated the storefront that way. And then by the end of the first summer, we opened our store in June. It was a shared space, so it was with an eco store. And we had 6 producer members by the end of that. And I think it just grew based on, finally somebody finding a market where they can control the price and be treated respectfully, and consumers gravitated towards it. We have over 800 members, individual members, because it had that assurance, right, that these berries are the price that the pickers wanted them to be, right? And so, I think that it was mainly just through the model that people gravitated towards it, and some don't. Like, it's interesting to see how competitive some people are, right? Particularly the country market, when we're all just trying to sell local food. We're not trying to eat into their business or anything, So, but I think it attracts cooperative-minded individuals, and from there it spreads.
And it's located here in Winnipeg? In Thunder Bay?
Yeah.
Did I say that?
So our storefront is here, but we're a regional cooperative. So like I said, we help supply 7 different remote markets, and they're expanding constantly. We had 5 at the end of last year, and 2 more have come on now. And there's specific challenges, but like we try to address at a community level. So Moose Factory came on. I don't know if there's anybody from Moose Factory, just a couple months ago, but they're not eligible for Nutrition North, despite the fact that you have to helicopter into the community during 2 times out of the year, right? And so they are, yes, sort of rail accessible, but I don't know how the communities were determined, because like Wapakika, you can drive a half an hour to KI. Wapakika gets 5 cents a kilogram, and KI gets $1.60. Right, and so how these communities' eligibility was determined, I don't know. But for Moose Cree, like we're really glad to work with them, because that challenge of helicoptering over food during the breakup is significant, and to reduce the cost, the initial cost of the food, but also to have the farmers get what they need, I think is a critical relationship.